Listen up, folks. Time could be running out to lock in a historic yield at public.com.
The Fed just did a rate cut a couple weeks ago. There's more on the calendar. So who knows how long these rates are going to last?
That might be great for you if the Fed is cutting, if you're in the market to buy a home. It's not great for the interest that you're currently earning on your cash. What's the solution? Possibly the public bond account. If you want to lock in a 6% or higher yield with a diversified portfolio of high yield and investment grade corporate bonds, you might want to act fast. Go to public.com/compound for more information. Michael, read the disclaimer.
Brought to you by Public Investing, member FINRA and SIPC. As of 9/26/24, the average annualized yield to worst across the bond account is greater than 6%. Yield to worst is not guaranteed, not an investment recommendation. All investing involves risk. Visit public.com/disclosures/bond-account for more info.
Okay, we are here with Professor Jeffrey Sonnenfeld. Professor Sonnenfeld is the Senior Associate Dean for Leadership Studies and Lester Crown Professor in Management Practice at the Yale School of Management, as well as the founder and president of the Chief Executive Leadership Institute, a nonprofit educational and research institute focused on CEO leadership and corporate governance. I've asked Jeff to come back and tell us a little bit about what he's hearing, what he's seeing in terms of CEOs of publicly traded companies preparing for Trump 2.0. Professor, thank you so much for coming by. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Josh. It's an honor to join you again. The loyalty and vocality of your following is fantastic. So I'm
awesome.
Thrilled to join your community.
Yes, the compounders love you. Let's start with the tariff announcement. So we all knew something was coming. We all knew tariffs would be central to the Trump vision for how we, quote unquote, make America great again. There was a tweet, or I think it was on Truth Social about a week ago, that I thought would have a bigger impact on the market than it actually had. But the stock market shrugged that off within, 12 hours. And it just seems to me that everyone on the street is now starting to figure out, oh, here's the story with the tariffs. It's really more of a negotiating ploy. It's the way that he opens up these conversations with the world, and then he allows leaders to come and negotiate their own separate situations. Am I reading that Wall Street response right in your view?
You are. There's a lot of subtlety and nuance that you captured with amazing efficiency. You're exactly right. The CEOs instinctively don't like the tariffs. However, they selectively do appreciate certain ones, and we can talk about which ones they are. And then there's the overall approach that Trump has to negotiating. The CEO community, the major CEOs of the largest companies throughout American history, or just the last 150 years since the creation of the Republican Party, have overwhelmingly been supportive of the GOP, the Republican candidate, so much so that publicly of the Fortune 100, since Fortune's been around, and the predecessor lists of the largest companies, have more than half of them have regularly endorsed vocally, but financially supported the GOP candidate. They came to a halt in 2016 and went to zero. In 2020, it was only 2. And right now, until Elon Musk signed on post the horrific shooting attempt, well, it was shot, but an assassination attempt in Butler County in July this summer, there was nobody, including Musk. Then now, Steve Schwarzman, of course, was there, but it's not a Fortune 100, 200, 300, 400 company. It's Blackstone's a hugely significant force. But they were leery. They were leery before, but they came rushing to him in 2017 in January when he came into office because they're patriotic, and they also recognize there are many fine qualities to work with him that they could try to develop. And that's where they were now. The trade issues before, when they saw what happened. So there's some history here, Josh, just on tariffs and trade issues. There's in 1962, there was legislation, well, predates us on this, but it's the Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act that gave the president national security opportunities to not rely on an act of Congress to make trade sanctions happen. Wilbur Ross, who is a good friend of mine, as periodically President Trump has just posted something very favorable to my surprise on me on Truth Social 2 nights ago. is we actually have a library that Wilbur Ross, who are right behind me, dedicated. He came out with some tough metals import that supposedly threatened national security in March of 2018 with a 25% tariff on steel and 10% on aluminum. And a lot of this was going after China, but actually NATO has been doing a lot of, some of the EU countries doing a lot of metals dumping here. And the Republican Party used to be very protectionist until the early 1950s. Then they flipped. Senator Charles Percy, who was the first CEO senator from when Bell and Howell's a real company, led the party to switch, and they became very free trade oriented. Well, these trade sanctions kind of backfired because China stopped buying grain, and that's what's been repeated a bit lately, but that was the context. And Trump, to the surprise of many, wilted. That he has a fantastic special the trade representative, and yet because of the blowback of China stopped, they buying $300 billion worth of goods that we put on China, is that they stopped buying beef and pork and corn and soybeans. Farmers revolted, so we kind of quietly back channeled and said they'd massively increased their buying of farm products, and we lost everything that Bob Lighthizer was negotiating for fairly toughly. So they've seen that sometimes it's a tough bark. And then he's relented. There's some of the military grade chip issues that actually President Biden intensified were pretty good, and selectively we've needed them. And candidly, there has been a problem, say, with autos getting into the EU. Our vehicles have to pay a 10% tariff. Our makers coming into the U.S., they only have a 2%. However, the way we went about it backfired so much so that Harley Davidson couldn't get product into the EU, not because of inflation issues, which are economists tell us could be 16, 18, some say 20%, but because of reciprocal trade barriers. Matt Levitich of Harley had to shut down, 100% of his bikes of Harley were made in the U.S. He had to shut down a plant in Kansas City and open one in Thailand. President Trump went nuts over that and said, "Don't buy Harleys." What are you doing? What about back? This is all gave up. So that led, and only 2 to 3% of the international motorcycle market are Harleys. In fact, it's all non-U.S. pretty much competition out there. And the Harley is the American icon. It's the logo is the bald eagle. Like, what are you doing? So yeah, there were some backfires on trade policy. So they think his bark is worse than his bite, but that negotiating strategy to punch somebody in the nose and then everything else seems reasonable afterwards backfires sometimes. And so they just think it's more bark than bite, and they could be wrong.
So Jeff, it sounds like, here's what this reminds me of. You ask people, what do they think of Congress? The lowest possible rating in the world. It's like infectious disease and then Congress. That's the favorability rating. But then you ask people about their own congressperson, and they tend to be a lot more positive. That's what this reminds me of. You say to an American CEO, how do you feel about tariffs? Oh, tariffs are terrible. What about in your industry? Well, actually, there are some real trade issues here, and maybe Trump is the right guy to solve them. It sounds like there's some of that going on.
Yeah, there is some of that going on, and it's just that we've relented on the most important fronts. Huawei, for example, you remember when because of national security issues, if there's anybody on this call, on this podcast that works for Nortel, they're lying, because Nortel doesn't exist anymore. Any Nortel employee would tell us, this was the biggest telecom company in Canada, that Huawei stole all their trade secrets. And Mike Rogers, who is a great Republican, he was running for Senate. And lost, but he was a congressman, led the Intelligence Committee for Congress to find it. In fact, the claims against Huawei by Nortel and others were very legitimate, as they've been stealing, but they actually, Trump put in prison, or at least the Canadians, at the request of the U.S., put in a luxurious detention the CFO of Huawei, who was the daughter of the founder of Huawei. And meanwhile, the Defense Department was just horrified about non-proliferation problems with Huawei. Also, but we relented. We let her out because they captured two Canadians unjustly, and the whole thing dissolved. So that bark dissolved against a huge trade problem. Similarly with ZTE, an electronics company, where we know their parts were going into Iranian drones and other weapons and North Korean weapons. Trump, was going to shut them down with sanctions, and Xi Jinping complained. Next thing we know, there was a $900 million, $800 million loan to bail out an Indonesian resort that the Trump organization had from China. Now, it turns out when that went public, the Trump organization surrendered it, but they'd already given up the deal on going after sanctions against ZTE, saying, Trump himself said, that'll be too severe against China. It'll be 50,000 jobs. What are you talking about? Like, this is a huge trade problem affecting national security the way the law was supposed to be. So people are confused that in reality, it hasn't worked out that well. And going after Canada and Mexico right now, when he talked about the trade deal of the USMCA, the reborn, NAFTA deal, that he's attacking the parties on that. I think, well, wait, but you just said this was the greatest deal ever. Why are you attacking Canada and Canada and Mexico over this? So people are confused. Now, we'll see what rolls out. Bob Lighthizer was a really good negotiator, and Peter Navarro, who I actually introduced to Trump, believe it or not, will be part of the trade negotiation team. Peter takes no prisoners. Although he was one briefly.
He was a prisoner recently.
Is that he has these 7 deadly sins, and I think he'll hold the ground more. These 7 deadly sins include things like the forced technology transfer to Chinese companies, like all data originated in China has to stay in China, and U.S. companies have agreed to that. Peter won't be silent about that.
So it sounds like from what you've described, the lack of typical CEO support for Trump from the Fortune 500, it sounds like we've come a long way just in terms of CEOs willing to come out publicly and say, look, I don't agree with everything Donald Trump says, but he's our president and I want to work with him. Last night at the DealBook conference in New York, Jeff Bezos got on stage with Andrew Ross Sorkin, and the actual quote was, he's optimistic about Trump's second term, expressed some excitement about potential regulatory cutbacks. He said, quote, I'm very optimistic this time around. He seems to have a lot of energy around reducing regulation. If I can help do that, I'm going to help him. We do have too many regulations in this country. Okay, so there's that wing of CEO desire about limiting regulation, deregulation, et cetera. Kara Swisher said Jeff just wants a space contract. That was her reaction, but that might be too cynical. I actually think people like Bezos like some of Trump's policies. You've got Zuckerberg having lunch at Mar-a-Lago last week. You've got the Coinbase CEO doing the same. There's an unfreeze happening. So it just seems like the tone now is, we're not afraid of Twitter. We will do a photo op with the president. We will do lunch. We will go to Mar-a-Lago. It seems constructive, even if you're a Democrat, just the fact that we're not going to be perpetually at war, Wall Street versus the White House. Is that your read on the tone and the vibe right now?
To a person, regardless of what their sentiment was pre-election, I think you're exactly right. And I always encourage Kara Swisher to be as cautious and cynical and even fun and flamboyant as she can be. And I believe that Bezos' agenda is a complex one, and the coincidental time of the meeting that he had of his space executives the very same day that they pulled the editorial that
not a great look.
Support for Harris. Not a great look. Yeah. It was a timing issue. Sure, there are plenty of publications that don't do. The Wall Street Journal has never done endorsements and things like that. Bezos' timing was the issue, not his decision per se. But the CEOs all came together in 2017. And what discouraged them, even though they didn't support him, I brought Donald Trump to one of our CEO summits, for example. Many of the names that you and I would talk about on this show and other discussions we'd have at the top tier, they'd said, if I'm going to bring him into the Waldorf, we're walking out. That whole top tier did walk out when I brought him in. and he was offended by that. And if your life depended on it, you can't name a single CEO of a major company that Donald Trump knew before he became president. He did not know them. He wasn't accepted by them. You could say he wasn't part of the club. He's an outer boroughs guy with resentment. I don't know what it is, but he was running what they saw as a family tribal enterprise that had some global anchoring, but is mainly a regional player and not a public company and not part of any of their scale or size issues. But they decided when he got elected, as Trump told me, because he said, all those guys that walked out at me on the Waldorf, he said, they're all coming by here now. I said, well, gee, I wonder why that is. And he thought he'd win them over by getting Rex Tillerson, for example, as one of that crowd in his, Secretary of State. That Stephen Colbert called him Tex drillers, then, as you recall. That didn't work because what he did is they fought to join these business advisory councils. The press thinks there were two of them. There are three of them. They wanted to be on them. A manufacturing council, one was cross industry and stuff. Is that he started his habitual modus operandi, which sometimes works for him, sometimes backfires, which is the divide and conquer scheme. He used it in the schoolyards as a kid. He used it in New York development circles, which is why a lot of his peers resented him. And he used it to create chaos in the Republican Party. But he also used it to try to divide Canada and Mexico in negotiations, or Germany, and France, because he didn't like the EU, NAFTA, and NATO, and all that. He hates collective action, and he knows that a bully gets beaten if there's collective action. So he went in with not liking the business roundtable at all. He wanted to break them into pieces. So he had Ford and GM fighting with each other. You remember they come out in the White House lawn. It was really awkward. But publicly over chocolate cake, literally, at Mar-a-Lago, he had and I've got their emails to show you how often, which I probably shouldn't show you, but if I had the posting opportunity, the CEOs of Boeing and Lockheed bewildered, and Raytheon, as RTX was known at the time.
Drug pricing stuff on Twitter in his first
J&J,
100
Merck,
days.
and everything. Yeah.
Yep.
Is highly sensitive things that they're battling, and they hated that. So when it rolled around and they started becoming increasingly resentful. So by August of 2017, after the Charlottesville, they got tired of these national infrastructure weeks while we had him using them as photo ops. Ken Frazier walked off of Merck, and it started a mass exodus of CEOs, and they never came back. We've never had in American history anybody who refused a national call to service by the commander in chief. Even JFK, who called the business community a bunch of SOBs, had a better rapport. So he alienated them by this divide and conquer stuff. They decided, okay, maybe he won't do it in a second round. If he starts it again now, it's not going to work. Yes, we have Tim Cook and we have Jeff Bezos. We have Mark Zuckerberg showing some efforts to try to get a fresh start. Hopefully it'll work. But if he goes back,
can we double click on Tim Cook? From my uninformed perspective, he seems to have been the CEO who most had the Trump thing figured out in the first term. You would have thought a tariff war with China would have been as disastrous for Apple as it would have been for any other American public company. Apple both relies on China for manufacturing, and it's Apple's second largest market to sell iPhones into. And for whatever reason, Cook very skillfully was able to thread the needle of being a paragon of, I don't want to say liberal, but let's just call it unoffensive, centrist, creativity. And it didn't lose that community, but he was also able to sit down with Trump and get what he needed for the benefit of Apple. And I don't know, is there a CEO who played it better last time? Is that the playbook this time?
Tim Cook is extraordinary. With none of the flamboyance of Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or other very impressive technology leaders that some may consider wisely as some of the most creative leaders we've ever had in technology, Tim Cook is one of the most artful. He suspends his ego. He is otherworldly humble. I confess I have some holdings in Apple stock, but he's also going to be our legend of leadership. We all do, and it's a good thing. We have he's going to be our legend of leadership winner in 2 weeks at our upcoming CEO summit, in which he is reluctantly accepting. Some of these guys lobby for it. He reluctantly taking it. He has managed to begin a process of trying to take about 25% of the 90% of his production, which is in China, to try to take 25% of it towards Vietnam. He's not there yet, but his ability to work with Donald Trump quietly, when he at the White House, when Donald Trump would call him Tim Apple, rather than make a joke about it, he'll go by Tim Apple when instead of Tim Cook. Is that he's not trying for cheap shots. There's no grandiosity about him. I think you're right. It is interestingly, how he's done it. Now, Vivek Ramaswamy and Peter Navarro have been very critical. So we'll see if they go mute on this and toe the line with Trump to work with Tim Cook. And I think they will, but I think you're exactly right. And it's to see that the business community just can't be, though, going through a divide and conquer again, or else we'll see through collective action. This again is how they take down the bullies. They believe in the rule of law more than the law of rulers, and that's where they invest. And they just can't stand these wedge issues, the bathroom bill type issues that are just created to divide society. They don't like that. Trump is not. I'll tell you this. I've known him. I was the first one to be critical, even before Tim O'Brien, now Bloomberg, when he was back at the Times, critical of the first run of The Apprentice. The Wall Street Journal had me write a weekly column that NBC would give me the show a day in advance, and Trump got pretty defensive when I called it a musical chairs game at a Hooters restaurant and wanted to tear up the deal. So he said he can't write a second column. So the Wall Street Journal was so happy about the traffic. They said, well, maybe Sonnenfeld will rescind. They gave me a second shot. I said, well, President Trump, or he wasn't President Trump, Mr. Trump wanted to know if I would recant what I'd said. I said I wouldn't. He's right, though. I do recant. Last week, I said that was the worst possible episode on TV I could imagine to portray business leadership. I hadn't seen this week's episode yet, so I recant. But we wound up burying the hatchet, and we've become friendly. But I do, worry if he goes back into the divide and conquer scheme. He shouldn't do that, but he can't help himself on that. But I would bring leftist oriented sociologists, political scientists to see him at Trump Tower, and he would confide in us. I could show you the text where he was looking at going to the left of Bernie Sanders. He is not a right-wing ideologue. He's supported more Democratic candidates and Republican candidates through his career. Is that he's looking for anger in society. And what's the hidden truth here is that some of the strongest supporters of the pro-regulation and antitrust policies of Biden have been some people on the MAGA right, including the vice president designate Vance. And Matt Gaetz and others, and supported by, of all things, AOC and Elizabeth Warren. And, and what it is, they go back to populist roots. It's anti-authority, anti-corporate, religion, anti-government.
Well, that's a really important point. This is not a slam dunk for big business just because Trump is back and he's talking about deregulation. There are a lot of reasons for why companies like Microsoft and Alphabet are not out of the woods in some of these antitrust battles that predate Trump 2.0. Even if Lina Khan goes, some of these things are actually favorable to Trump world to have these very powerful businesses on the defensive and answering to the government. So this is not going to be an across the board, hey, it's a Republican administration, don't worry about antitrust. I don't picture any of this stuff going away overnight. Do you?
No, not at all. Trump likes the anger, and there is resentment about the privacy issues, about antitrust concerns, about promotion of hate speech, or the opposite, the censoring of conservative speech, or whatever it is out there. There's a lot of resentment of big tech and some other large enterprises, so the pharma people, of course, are quite nervous. And, we could talk about the RFK Jr. nomination, some of these other cabinet picks that have the business community quite alarmed because they're anything but pro-capitalist, and they're very much pro-regulation, to be wanting to endorse the nanny state as RFK wants to do it to
Well,
determine.
let's do the cabinet. So you wrote in Fortune, this is you. Trump has designed most of his choices for his management committee and cabinet, but they vary in skill, experience, and temperament. Which of these lieutenants hold primary influence with Trump will determine whether he builds on the great economic momentum handed to him or squanders it. We have classified these players into three groups: the fortifiers, the good; the detractors, the bad; and the unknowns, mercurial influencers who might do good or harm. All right, let's start with the fortifiers. Who do we like if we're in the pro-business camp? Who are the fortifiers?
Is somebody who's stable for markets, understands business and finance, is not a flamethrower, but is very loyal to Trump. Scott Bessent.
Okay.
Scott Bessent was a great choice. Howard Lutnick is a very smart guy, extremely successful, but he's a far more volatile personality and who is quite divisive, even in the Wall Street crowd. As the people who know him
Bessent
best.
is commerce, and they're going to have him involved in the China conversation for some reason.
This is a big question. Is
Yeah.
If he was merely sidelined the way Vivek Ramaswamy was happily by putting into an advisory role, that would be fine. Commerce, you would say, was less threatening, unless we have another Sharpie game example where which reports to Commerce, where the National Weather Service was being told to lie and to say a hurricane's going into Alabama because President Trump mistakenly said it was, or the U.S. Census that reports to Commerce. Commerce can't do a lot of damage other than some of those areas. However, Lutnick wants the special trade rep to report to him. Of course, Bob Lighthizer would never have taken that position, but one of his deputies who was very good did. And that's going to be awkward. Now, I don't know how that can report to Commerce, given that it was a congressional creation that it reports to the president. So we'll see how that gets worked out legally. But that the special trade rep can be very effective here. Lutnick's bravado can be problematic, but fortunately he's not in the Treasury role, because Treasury is the one who actually, instead of designs it, they're the ones who
So
execute.
you like Bessent though.
Bessent
like
is
that pick.
very good. It was a big snow shovel in the face of Elon Musk, who very much did not want Bessent, and he lost on this one. He wanted Lutnick. So, Musk has lost many of his picks. He wanted Gates, that didn't work out. Putting in, I think, as Secretary of State, Senator Rubio is an excellent choice. A lot of my friends here in academia wouldn't like him. So what? The president gets to pick somebody who's consistent with his views. Marco Rubio is a very good problem solver, very sophisticated, very smart guy. Representative Stefanik would be hugely unpopular here on campus, but still, she's what he represents in terms of President Trump's points of view and what many of his voters, if not all of his voters, want to be represented in the United Nations. And sorry to be sliding around here. Sunlight's coming in here as I take some of these controversial campus positions. There's a beam coming through that's suspicious. But that she's a great choice for what he wants. However, well, I don't want to anticipate you, but
let's go to the people that you would say are the detractors. Do you have Tom Homan as a detractor, or this is?
It's not that well known. I think he certainly got to be consistent with what Trump wants. We could in fact have a whole discussion of immigration policies and what this means. Again, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm on the board of Lennar. And, one of the nation's premier, I would say the premier home builder, but there are a number, is that as we take a look at what the ripple effects of immigration can be, is we can't pull out 10 million people just at once, or we've now gutted the agriculture business, which is, conservatively 30% undocumented immigrants in so much of,
Well, let me quote you. You say 30% of farm workers are U.S. born. Only 30%. 40% have no work authorization. more than 20% of the 1.6 million construction workers in America are foreign born. And in some cities, 40% are undocumented. It should go, the American tech workforce, 25% are immigrants. It should go without saying that you get a lot of applause at a rally for talking about removing 10 million undocumented people or illegal immigrants. But the reality on the ground, trying to run a business in America becomes really difficult if these things were to come to pass, like the
Yeah, if they were
extreme
to
version.
pass, there needs to be a pathway for legitimacy. I mean, the Washington Post have actually shown that the first 10 jobs that Melania Trump had, she was an undocumented immigrant at the time. Big deal. They work it out. She's certainly not a threat to American society and is a good person. Is that the hardworking employed people that are sometimes resented by many immigrants who did the proper process and came here legally. So that was a big mistake the Democrats had, to think that there was going to be a national kinship between all Hispanics, let's say, with those who abided by the laws and those who didn't. But still, just moving to the economic impact, we can't destroy the agriculture and construction industries. But even in technology, Stephen Miller was taking such a tough line. Just between us and your viewers, I'll name some names. In the summer of 2019, because I'm pretty close to Jared Kushner, I went to him and I went to three other cabinet secretaries that I've known for a very long time. And they just said, we can't get around Stephen Miller. He has a Rasputin-like grip on Trump on the immigration issues for the H-1B visa. So, we're going to train these people and not hold on to some, going to send them back to China. No, we want to keep this talent here. Is two of the big tech companies that you mentioned 10 minutes ago gave me the answer, because working with the Business Roundtable, Doug McMillan, who was chairman at the time, said, look, this is not my primary issue. I don't know, but he created a committee led by Chuck Robbins, the CEO of Cisco. This story not been told publicly before. Chuck Robbins was fantastic, working with other members of the Business Roundtable who were going to be severely hurt by the loss of great tech talent. They found that several of their members were already leasing space, not in some distant seaports with different time zones, in Toronto and Vancouver, and we're now negotiating the infrastructure to support that leased space. So these jobs are going to just hop over the border. That's what convinced Trump to get around Stephen Miller and dial back some of the hostility H-1B visa issues. Literally half of Fortune 500 companies, 50%, are led either by immigrants or first-generation CEOs. Similarly, a third of tech companies that are tech startups that are worth over $1 billion are created by immigrants. That's tens of millions of jobs, and we just need to work out in the immigration front. And we'll see. Obviously, there's been a problem, but the numbers tell a little bit different story than what some of the campaign trail understood. It got out of control under Biden with 200,000 a month, but basically the last 6 months it's been down to 40,000 a month. Well, what was it under Trump? 50,000 a month. So actually, though, it took Biden too darn long to get the executive order in place because they thought they'd have bipartisan legislation that failed. But ultimately, they got it worked out in these last 6-10 months. But under Obama, it was less than that. It was around 30,000 a month and shot up to 80,000 actually under Trump. So
right.
This has not been as easy as some people think, and it is definitely a problem, though.
Jeff, I want to ask you about one more, and this is breaking news as of this morning. I wanted to ask you about the new SEC chair. Trump has nominated former Securities and Exchange Commissioner Paul Atkins to replace Gary Gensler. Gensler, very notably, last week, as Bitcoin approached $100,000, said he would step down when his term was up. Paul Atkins, obviously pro-crypto, but also obviously someone who has spent a lot of time in securities regulation. So this is not one of those picks where it's coming from outer space. This was somebody who was widely expected to be in the conversation. What do you think the Wall Street take is on bringing Atkins in for this role?
Well, I have a point of view here it's an informed one, but it's a biased one. Or people might wonder if it's biased. So just to get in the interest of full disclosure, I'm mentioning I own Apple stock, and I'm on the board of Lennar. I'm also on the board of an exchange called IEX that only your viewers would know about. The general public wouldn't know. It's a fantastic exchange that is I think more transparent into who's pays who's and all the rest, and they don't have a payment for
This
order
is the
flow.
exchange that Michael Lewis wrote about in his book on high frequency trading.
Right. And Paul Atkins was not wildly in favor when he was an SEC commissioner of that before. And yet everybody at IEX, I probably shouldn't be speaking off, on the record on this, but they're actually quite enthusiastic about Paul Atkins, because they think even though he wasn't their big apostle and was, he has questions about the flow of information. He has questions about the free flow markets. He's hugely sophisticated point of view. He absolutely understands cryptocurrencies opportunities. So we think that that a lot of innovative deals will pass through faster. Exchanges, currency exchanges, I think will be I think properly overseen. So there's a lot of encouragement, surprisingly, even from IEX, that is quite excited about working with Paul Atkins. I think that there's a little bit of fear that there's, just between us, there is one player in the space, Tether, that people don't have the same level of confidence for various reasons, and that Howard Lutnick has a significant stake there and some relationships there that might have been worrisome to some. That Paul Atkins doesn't have these kinds of conflicts. I think he had a consulting firm that was close. I don't think it was the high frequency traders or the exchanges or whatever. He just has actually real knowledge in this space, even though he has very strong points of view how markets should work. I think it's hard to do better than that choice for sheer knowledge and expertise. He's not a flamethrower. So I think he'll be a very good problem solver. Even if I don't like all of his decisions, I think they're going to be based on fact and reality, and not on superstition.
Well, Jeff, we're going to leave it there.
JFK or RFK
please.
Jr., who thinks drinking water can determine gender. I think the pharma companies are really worried, but they're going to be able to work with it. I think some of the pharma companies are already realizing there's a way to explain the science of vaccines to him, and they're hopeful.
I very studiously avoided including RFK Jr. stuff in the pre-show notes today, because I know that could be its own 45-minute discussion. So I want to be respectful of your time. We're going to leave it there. I just want to say thank you so much for updating us all on all this activity. It's a whole new world, and you're super informed about all of the players and the various interests competing at this point. So could not have thought of a better person to bring into the discussion. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeff, and hopefully we can check in with you soon.
Anytime. It's a huge honor. And when I start hearing from everybody's lawyers that we talked about, I'll send them your way.
Feel free.